in Argentina is grappling with economic turmoil under President Javier Mele, whose controversial austerity measures and reforms have sparked widespread protests. While inflation has dropped from 211% to 118% last year, the country still faces severe economic challenges. Mele's promises of dollarization and public spending cuts have led to public unrest. The General Confederation of Labour has called for a 24-hour strike by April the 10th, 2025, in response to layoffs and reduced purchasing power. Unions argue that Mele has worsened unemployment and eroded workers' rights. While the government continues to struggle with currency devaluation, inflation remains high, and despite some optimism about lifting currency controls, economic forecasts remain bleak. Meanwhile, protests against the president continues. A ring of steel was erected around Congress, with several streets cordoned off and metal grills barring access to the building. Well, to discuss these developments and the upcoming protest, joining us is Professor Madhav Nalapat, the editorial director of the Sunday Guardian, who's joining us from India. Professor Nalapat, thank you as always for joining us and for your time. We have a situation here in Argentina where the economy is improving, but at what cost? And why are the people unhappy?
Look, the fact is that inflation is still horribly high. And frankly, this is a lesson that Donald Trump needs to learn from, for a simple reason that when you push reforms beyond a point at which they are acceptable to the broad public, then frankly, those reforms cannot work, however well-intentioned they are. In the case of Javier Mele, that's precisely what has happened. He has pushed, he has basically laid off tens of thousands of Argentinian employees, state employees, who were promised a lifetime job, and now he just laid them off. And more importantly, inflation has gone down, but is going down way too slowly for the Argentinian people. And of course, I agree that some of the austerity measures are necessary. At the same time, you have to ensure that the poor are looked after. That there is some kind of a floor below which you cannot fall, even if you have nothing. And that floor has to be provided in the shape of food, in the shape of some kind of housing, and some quality health care. Let's be honest. It can't happen any other way. That's a lesson that Prime Minister Modi has learned in India. He's got a health care program. He's also got a food distribution program, which frankly has been distributing food to 800 million people, which is something of an historical record. And the reality is, in housing also, efforts are being made to ensure low-cost housing. But unless there is a floor to even those who have nothing, well, very frankly, there is going to be an upwelling of protest. And that protest could well derail all the well-intentioned reforms that are being tried. Javier Mele is definitely well-intentioned, but the fact is he may have gone too far, too fast, and frankly, he may not have looked after, the poor of Argentina, and as a consequence, people in the middle class asking, what if this is me tomorrow? What if I get in this situation and I'm practically begging on the road tomorrow? So the reality is that you have to have a policy of reform, correct, but you also have to have a clear floor below which even a person or a family that has no income, zero income, gets something. And this goes against the grain of some of these ideologues. They say that, you're not getting a job because you don't deserve a job. Well, that may be true in the case of some. It's certainly not true in the case of all. But the sad reality is, if unemployment persists for 5 to 7 years, then you become almost unemployable. It's impossible to retrain you into getting a productive job. So then you become unemployable. And even at that stage, frankly, if you have nothing, well, Karl Marx said very clearly, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And you're going to see violence and protest take place. So I think, Marx maybe his economic policies may or may not have worked, but certainly that particular, the point needs to be stressed, which is there has to be a clear flow. And oddly, that point was stressed by a conservative economist of the previous, era, Alfred Marshall, one of those who founded modern economic science. And Marshall said what he called the residuum, the lowest level of society, you have to look after them.
Yes.
And Marshall was a very modern economist. He basically was a Keynesian before Keynes came on the scene. And I think that lesson of Marshall needs to be learned by Javier Mele. And frankly, beyond a point, that ring of steel will also fail. It didn't work in the case of Bashar Assad because people were so disgusted with what was happening that that finally even the ring of steel melted down and began supporting them. And that is what happened in Bangladesh, where the corruption of Sheikh Hasina led to several in the military supporting the anti-Hasina forces. Of course, there's been a blowback now, and there is some reconsideration of that policy. But you have to understand there are limits beyond which you must not allow your citizens to endure. And if you do so, you are at risk, because then people who are higher up the food chain will start getting nervous, there go I tomorrow. So I think that's a lesson, frankly, that Javier Mele hasn't learned, and he would do well to learn, because these protests are not new. In 2024, there were violent protests, and at that time it worked. At that time, people were willing to give him a chance. Today, much less people are willing to give him a chance. They had too much of poverty, combined with too much of 100 and whatever inflation, which is still way too high. That means prices are double in a year, which is way too high. So I'd like to say that lesson of what Marshall called the residuum and looking after the residuum needs to be learned by Javier Mele if his reforms are to succeed. And he has to backtrack on some of the more radical of them, such as, for example, removing from jobs so many Argentinians. I think, very frankly, that's created a certain degree of helplessness, which is then hopelessness, and then the helplessness gets transformed into violence. So that is something that he needs to watch out from.
I want to look at what could be done in this instance then, because of course he's been very extreme with how he's looking to tackle austerity, these anti-austerity measures. How else can he go about it without making these radical changes? Of course, you've mentioned already high levels of unemployment that are growing, also looking at the social sector and how that's being treated. What can he be doing differently, and how might that improve relations with the people, which is something that he's obviously needing to do given the current discontent that we're seeing amongst some?
Well, that's a very, very good point. And I'd like to say that, you have to understand that even the very rich need to understand that the very poor need to be looked after for them to be safe in any country. Even the very rich need to understand that. I mean, if that lesson is not learned, you go the way of Sheikh Hasina and become a refugee, and your government falls and extremists take over. That's what happened in several locations. Extremists took over, initially at least, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Taliban have now come back, and of course they're now shifting their policy a little bit. But the reality of the situation is, when those who have nothing look from their shanties, from their huts, which by the way are routinely destroyed by the police, and they look at the huge skyscrapers and the limousines and the condos and the villas of the very rich, frankly, that helplessness turns into anger and a hopelessness that says, all right, all I've got are my chains, maximum I lose is my life, and anyway, this life is not worth living. When people start believing that their lives are not worth living, that particular government is at risk. And I fear that's happening to Javier Mele in Argentina.
Professor Madhav Nalapat, thank you very much for your time.